Hey everyone, hope you're having a good week. Last week we talked about Saint Augustine, and his letter to a deacon in Carthage who was asking for advice on how to better catechize the people in his city. And we talked about how Augustine names different causes for weariness or tiredness in us that might make us not be cheerful. When he says that this joyful cheerfulness is really one of the virtues of the best catechists. So last week we talked about his first two causes. First one, which is when we just don't want to turn religious ideas or truths into words. And the second one is when we prefer other people's words to our own, words of a textbook or words of a video, words of a theologian or an expert. Today, his third weariness is when we're just bored by the content, by the ideas themselves. And it's just repetitive for us or childish. And so we don't even really want to think about them. We'd rather move on to the higher stuff, the more advanced stuff. Now, he says that here what we need to do is just rediscover the joy of the learning process that we can share with our students. He says that if we have any kind of a love for our students that resembles the love of a mother or a father for their child, or an older brother or an older sister for their younger sibling, we'll understand what this joy is, because we can experience the joy of learning in someone that we love if we're teaching them. That's his answer. Now this makes me think of one of my favorite songs in the Tarzan soundtrack, the original Disney movie. It has a line that's just like this. It's in the song Son of Man, and he says, this is Phil Collins singing, he says this: "In learning you will teach, and in teaching you will learn. You'll find yourself beside the ones you love." And that's talking about Tarzan, but I think that's a perfect example of what Augustine is actually saying here. These are Augustine's words. "For so great is the power of a sympathetic disposition of mind, that as they are affected, they being the students, while we are speaking, the catechists, and we are affected while they are learning, we have our dwelling in each other. And thus, at one and the same time, they, as it were, in us, speak what they hear, and we in them learn after a certain fashion what we teach." Now Augustine goes on to give an example that, don't we all have a favorite nature scene in our hometown or in our commute, that whenever we bring someone new to town, we always want to show them, like, hey, check out this awesome view. And whenever that person discovers it for the first time, we also discover again the joy of it, even though we've seen that view a bunch of times. Augustine says that this is true for catechism as well, and that it's deeper the more intimate our friendship or our love is for those that we're teaching. Now I have an example of this. There's an 8th grader who just last month came to St. John's asking to be catechized. He's received baptism, but he's way behind on the other sacraments, and he wanted to see if there's some way to catch up to then join his class next year for confirmation. And so I started meeting with him before the virus came out, and in the first time we met, I just brought him into the church to show him some stuff, and he loved a lot of the woodwork. The altar rail that got put in St. John's. He was a super fan of that, and the Paschal candle, that big Easter candle, the Stations of the Cross, the woodwork on those. I loved seeing him kind of see those for the first time, and it made me realize again how beautiful those things really are. And he was asking me what they mean, and it was great. Another example I can think of is in the missionary community that I did my mission trip with, the house in Brooklyn. There's a young woman who is living and working in the city, and so lives with them and joins in the prayer life of the missionaries. She just converted to Catholicism 2 or 3 years ago, so she's really fresh. And my fiancée, Anna, lives with her, and it tells me a lot about how this young woman finds everything super interesting that she learns about the faith. So every time they hear a talk, or every time she learns something about the sacraments, or especially sacred music, or different types of prayers, she just falls in love with it, and it helps everyone around her. My fiancée tells me this, is that it helps them rediscover what those things are too. And that makes me ask myself, am I discovering like that the beauties in the faith that I hold to be true, or am I letting myself, grow a little cold to it? That's a real challenge for us catechists, and I think it's a temptation for us to not continually nourish ourselves by learning more or forming ourselves more in the faith. Discovering more of those awesome, beautiful things, little nuggets of truth and inspiration. So that's really important for us to do, and we should always ask ourselves, how are we doing it? First off, are we staying faithful and listening to the Sunday homilies? That's maybe the primary way of all of the faithful staying formed in their faith. But then beyond that, are we reading anything? Are we reading Scripture? Are we listening to podcasts? Are we taking advantage of any of the tons of ways that we could stay formed and receive religious instruction, which is a duty of all of us Catholics? Now, Augustine concludes this part on the third cause of weariness by also saying that if we're bored by any of this childish content, seems to us to be stuff that's repetitive, we've always heard a bunch of times, talking about First Communion again, we should remember how bad the situation would be for our students if they never knew this stuff. Imagine a person who doesn't know that the Eucharist is the real presence of Jesus Christ. And they're in the church and they're going to Mass, but they don't really know that. Oh my gosh, that would inspire me for sure. Okay, well, geez, I should really tell them. This is really matter. I don't care if I've already told a million people the same thing. This is new and fresh, and this matters. So that's Augustine on the third cause of weariness. Now his fourth is when he says that when we don't receive any positive body language feedback from the students in our class, that can make us lose our cheerfulness. Now he says there are 6 different ways that a student might not express with their bodies or asking questions or with their eyes or facial expression what they're thinking. And we should try to be aware of these 6 ways and always gauge in our classes whether we're trying to account for these and try to encourage our students to give feedback, because that does help us. So Augustine says the first reason why someone would not express themselves is if they're afraid of us. They look up to us as some kind of authority figure and they're afraid of us reprimanding them. So he says we should always be kind in our words, especially to the young ones, or to young kids for the first time that we're with them in a class. Be really kind. Make sure that they feel comfortable. Second reason one of the kids might not express themselves is if they admire us too much. They look up to us as some kind of perfect, some kind of God figure. Wow, they know everything. Oh my gosh, they're so great. And they almost that they revere us to the point of not wanting to, considering that we're different from them, and so they're not going to ask us questions or anything. And Augustine says we should remind our students that we are in the same boat as them, and especially high schoolers. I've noticed this in my experience, that high schoolers really respond well when they see that the teacher experiences the same struggles that they do. Augustine calls this brotherly affinity. Now the third reason is maybe our students don't understand us, so they're not responding or giving us feedback because they don't know what we're saying. So Augustine says we should remember to ask questions as we're teaching to engage whether the students are understanding. Fourth reason is that maybe the students don't have self-confidence. They have low self-esteem. They're afraid of asking a dumb question and appearing stupid in front of others. And so we should always emphasize as well in our classes that there are no stupid questions. That they should express whatever's on their minds. Fifth reason is maybe our students already know what we're talking about. They're bored because they've already heard it before. So we should also ask our students if they've already heard this kind of thing that we're talking about, or even before introducing a subject, ask what they do already know and try to gauge that way so that we're not just giving them repetitive material. And the last example is pretty funny. It's in the case of someone who's bored, one of the students is bored, but not because they already know everything, just because they don't care, and you can't inspire them at all. So Augustine has this great quote. He says, "In these cases, we ought rather to address ourselves to God for him then address much to him concerning God. Him being the student. That we ought to, in that case, we should just pray harder to God for the student's sake, rather than trying to force them to really learn much. Because it depends. God can only give the grace for them to learn. Now, Augustine concludes this part of his letter by then giving some advice on how to keep people's attention when you're catechizing. And I thought this was really useful. It'd be good for us to reflect on. His first topic is about standing versus sitting. Apparently in the early church, this was a big problem because maybe chairs weren't as common and gathering spaces weren't as, various or accommodating. And you might have people of all different ages traveling far to get to the spot where you're catechizing, and so you don't want someone not listening because they're just tired and need to sit down. So Augustine goes through a whole long, thing about that doesn't really concern us nowadays. But I think the idea of standing versus sitting is really important. I think we could really reflect on the activities that we have within our class. When are they sitting? Is there a point where they're ever standing, or are they sitting on the ground? These all evoke different types of learning or moods. I would say standing could be for something more active, like a game or a competition. It could also be for prayer in the beginning. Sitting, just at a table, is good for receiving, like a talk or discussion about a topic. Sitting on the floor is more of it invokes sympathy, I think, and sharing. So it's great also for prayer, especially with younger kids, and for giving personal witnesses, for like story time. It's great to have everyone sit down on the floor for story time. Now, Augustine then also says another important factor in keeping people's attention is your tone of speech. So he says you should always be ready with a couple of stories or different topic changes up in your sleeve, ready to pull out at any moment if you feel like people are losing their attention. Because he says that if you were to all of a sudden talk about something startling, that would get people's attention. Or something that's really actually like tragic or sad, he even says, could help evoke people's sympathy and get them listening again. Or just a refreshingly ordinary and easygoing topic. If you've been talking about dense things for a while, making some really ordinary comment could be refreshing and bring people's attention back. So I want to emphasize how good stories are. For the younger grades, I've had so much experience in times of catechism, different programs that I've done, is whenever you say, okay, now I have a story, especially for younger kids, there's woo, it's like the most exciting thing ever, and you've won the whole class back. Even if you just have to make up the story on the spot, just the fact that you're having story time is really exciting. And then for older grades too, for especially high schoolers or 7th and 8th grade, I think it's the gold. Like we've been talking about getting to the gold. They're really powerful and they're a really refreshing change of pace. So in the end, going off of this, I think each of us should do some reflecting. How do we plan our classes? What is the trajectory of our class? And do we have a good balance and variety of activities and stimulations? For example, let's say, this is maybe how I would think of an example class, say for 7th grade. If we were going to talk about heaven, what heaven is, maybe I would start off with everyone's walking in the class and I'll say, okay, 1 minute, silent brainstorming. List the first 10 things you think about when you hear the word heaven. Give everyone a sheet of paper, pencil, and we have a minute or a minute and a half of silence, and everyone's writing down. That usually goes over pretty well. First 10 things you think about when you hear the word heaven. Then I might say, okay, stand up. We're going to start the class off with a prayer. So we do that. They sit down again, and say, okay, we're going to talk about heaven today, and we're going to start off with a game, maybe like some kind of Family Feud type game where someone is a volunteer, and everyone else has to go around and guess one word that they think might be on that person's list, like words that describe heaven list. And if someone guesses the wrong word that's not on that person's list, they're out. But if someone guesses the word that's right, or it's pretty similar, they get to stay in. And you keep going around everybody in the class until either everyone's out or you've exhausted the person's list. I think that could be pretty fun. And then maybe that could lead into a lesson on what are the points you want to emphasize in talking about heaven. And maybe ask if people could get an extra point if someone had one of these words on their original list. He wanted to talk about how heaven is eternal. Maybe someone wrote down eternal or forever, and then that could be a great way of tying that back into that initial activity. So that's just an example, different types of things. So you have some teaching time, some game time, some silent reflecting time, some prayer time. That's enough for today. That's some nuggets from Augustine. We'll come back next week for Augustine on his 5th and 6th causes of weariness that might take away our cheerfulness and how to combat them. So please leave your comments below, and let's try to get some discussion starting. All right, take care.